If they were to read the book, they would be shocked at the extent to which young Americans, from all backgrounds, by the way, live their lives completely untethered to adult influences, adult voices, adult role models, adult expectations.
You just heard local educator and published author Jeremy Adams. Jeremy Adams, a teacher at both the high school and college level, has spent decades trying to instill wisdom, ambition, and love of learning in his students. And yet, as he notes in his book, Hollowed Out, when teachers get together, they often share an arresting conclusion. Something has gone terribly wrong. Something essential is missing in our young people. In today's episode, we talked about his book, Hollowed Out. We talked about how his life as an educator has changed over the last two and a half decades, actually, and his job at BHS, what the students have been like, what the changes they've seen and experienced. We've talked about how technology, devices play an important role in that. Overall, really, really great conversation. Very, very passionate man about what he does in his capacity as an educator, and it really rubbed off, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Our 2 Cents podcast, the show where your local professionals sit down with an array of guests to hear their story and impart some wisdom for both business and life-improving skills. This is your place to hear business and community leaders discuss relevant topics that matter to you.
And welcome back to the R2 Sets podcast. This is Kyle Jones. I'm sitting here with my co-host, Mr. Scott Hansen. And Scott, it's been about a month since you've been on with us. Is that right?
It has. I've been out a little bit, and I'm back at it.
Yeah.
So good to be back.
It's good to have you back. So before we get to today's episode with Jeremy Adams, local educator and author, I want to encourage our listeners to check out our webpage and sign up to our newsletter so you can keep up to date as to when we're going to be releasing new episodes and upcoming guests. Jeremy, thanks for joining us today in the studio. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for the invite. I'm excited to be in studio.
I know.
With some people.
We were talking about that a little before we going on air, and we did a lot. I would say probably, what would you say, maybe 20 or 30 podcasts, Scott, during COVID?
We did, Zoom, where we had to do Zoom. Yeah, it just wasn't the same thing, was it?
It wasn't. You just couldn't get that same connection, that interaction you get with face-to-face, so we're glad to be back and doing that.
Trust me, I know. 7 months of Zoom classes without end.
Oh, you're right.
With the kids having their cameras turned off and just seeing a name. I am really excited to be here.
We do not have to tell Jeremy about the painfulness of Zoom meetings.
Yeah, I was kind of forgetting who I was talking to and was complaining about Zoom. He's teaching kids for a year on Zoom.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, we have no right to complain, Kyle.
But we're back now. So it's a happy ending.
Well, let's kind of start with that. How is being back in school? How are the kids transitioning, and what's it like?
Well, first of all, the positive. I'm very happy to be back. It is great to be able to look my students in the eyes, even if that's all I see of them. It's nice to have the vibe of a school campus. Again, I think those of us who are educators, we find that there's a certain enchantment, a certain magic, a certain energy of being in a community with young people. And it keeps you young. And it also makes you feel old sometimes because, of course, I realize, the big thing nowadays is I try and be funny and they just tell me that's dad humor. And they nicely tell me, stay in your lane, Mr. Adams. But it is wonderful to be back, and I'm really happy. That being said, it is still difficult. It's a really hard year. I'm sitting here listening to myself on the radio. My voice is a little bit damaged, I think. Talking through a mask 5 hours a day is really difficult. My classroom is a huge classroom, high ceilings. It's a big classroom, so I'm kind of yelling the whole day. That's really, really difficult. And, sometimes, with COVID outbreaks, kids will disappear for 10 days at a time. Dances get canceled. Football games get canceled. Volleyball games get canceled. It's kind of like, I guess what I would say is, it's kind of like you have a best friend and you guys have a falling out and you're trying to make up and it doesn't quite feel the same yet. That's what it feels like this year. We're watching a pro baseball season, but the best players are on strike. So, I'm glad to be back in the stadium, but it doesn't quite feel the same yet.
Yeah. And is that something that you see continuing for the foreseeable future, or are we going to start seeing some? Because I'm sure you hear more what's going on as far as what's going to happen with classrooms and how that's going to change.
Well, first of all, anybody who can answer that question deserves to be well paid because they can see into the future. But my worry is, though, it's a great question because I worry that this is going to have a permanent transformation in education. The idea of masks all day, I understand why they're there now. I'm not a virologist or an epidemiologist. I'm not saying we shouldn't have them, but so much of the magic of the classroom is kind of that power of making a connection. It's a smile, it's a scowl, it's laughter, it's a serious point. And I do feel like, it's really hard to communicate and make that personal connection to the kids. There's a hesitancy there to engage. They're not as eager to, walk around and talk and ask questions because there is a kind of limiting factor there. So, there's definitely a different feel and tenor to the school year. Every teacher I've talked to from kindergarten to college will tell you, we're back, we're happy. It's not the same, and it's exhausting. And we hope that this doesn't go on like this forever.
Yeah, because I think you alluded to this, and I don't think it matters what grade level you're in, but speaking about, say, college, for example, I can't imagine college without the college experience. I can imagine high school without the high school experience. I think it even goes to elementary school because my 3 daughters are all in, well, my oldest one actually just started junior high this year, but they've been during COVID in elementary school. When we were going back to school this year, I have never seen them more excited to go back to school or to want to do school than them being absent for a year and a half. So their excitement to go back to school was kind of encouraging to me because it's used to like, school's coming and it takes them a while to get, motivated and up and running. But my kids were the exact opposite. They were dying to go back.
It's more than just going back to school. It's going back to
a social life.
Going outside the house.
Yeah, a social. I mean, seeing peers their age and teachers. I mean, I knew how important teachers are, but I didn't realize the impact they had until my kids were so excited to actually meet their teacher and have that interaction and to see how how my kids behave in front of teachers or at school versus at home. It's like, wow, they are raised well, I guess.
I do think what's interesting though is I do see in the high school kids that there is for some of them we talk about muscle memory in sports, the ability to throw the free throw or to hit the serve in tennis because you've done it a gazillion times. And you stop doing it and you lose that muscle memory. And I think, some of our older students have lost the muscle memory of how to be a student. I mean, if you think about it, and I'm going to sound like a dad here talking to my teenagers, but most of our lives are doing things we don't want to do. And if you look at what last year entailed for a lot of high school kids, they didn't have to get up. They didn't have to take a shower. They didn't have to get dressed. They had their cameras off. They admit that they were watching Netflix all day. They admit that they were texting one another, that they were taking group tests, that that they really weren't that engaged at all. And I think that's easy. And if you give a teenager an easy way out, they're going to perpetuate that if they can. And so, there have been some growing pains this year. I'll tell you the one moment that really stuck out was about the 3rd or 4th week. I think it was last week. We had our first big exam in my government class. And they said, well, we get to use our books and our notes, right? And I said, no, this is an honors class. You have to study and know the material. And they literally gasped. The student was like, yes, knowledge and skills take work to acquire. And so, but if you think about it, they have not studied in a year and a half. They have not gone to school in a year and a half. And so, I think they're starting to learn again that, acquiring an education of substance, achieving anything is hard. It takes time. Whatever you think about the last year and a half, we in the high school level, we've been encouraged to take work late, let them take tests late, be very, very lenient. And do you remember a few weeks after 9/11, do you remember the executive producer of SNL said, can we be funny again? Remember that?
Yeah, had permission.
Yeah, can we have permission? We teachers want to say, can we have high expectations again?
Yeah, can we raise that bar
Can we raise that
up?
bar again? Yeah, is it time to push you guys to be everything you want to be? Because I think it's about time. Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
Well, I think if it stays low, like it has been lowered, I think just bad things follow, right? Yep. And I think that's what you write about in your book. Before we get into your book and a lot of the other things that we want to talk about today, maybe we can back up and just maybe you can tell us a brief history on yourself and what got you into teaching. What gave you this passion for getting into education?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I've been teaching at Bakersfield High School. This is my 24th year. I know this is a podcast. You can't see me. I know I look way too young to be somebody who's been teaching for 24 years.
You got a hip shirt on.
We'll vouch for you.
Yeah,
we'll vouch for you, Jim.
Thank you. And I've been teaching in the political science department at CSU-B for 15 years. And, I come from a family of teachers. My mom and my dad were both teachers. And so the last thing I ever wanted to be in my life was a teacher. My father grew up in a shack in Oildale. His father was an alcoholic, and he didn't have a lot of opportunities. My mother grew up in the plains of Colorado, never met her father, didn't have a great mother. She was very emotionally abusive. So my parents are my heroes. They are, the greatest quote about education comes from Newton, who said, if I have seen further than others, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. Well, I stand on the shoulders of my parents. Mm-hmm. They shielded me from the horrors of their childhood, and they gave me extraordinary opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so I was always brought up, the bad thing about that though, was I was brought up with this idea that, teaching is great, but you should do more than that. Go be a lawyer, go be an accountant, go run for office, go write the great American novel, do something grandiose with your life. And so, I went away to what I consider to be a prestigious school on the East Coast, but then something happened to me that is hard to describe. And I've kind of stopped describing it to 15 and 16-year-olds because they think it's odd. But I really fell in love with learning in college. I read a book my senior year of college called The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. And it's about a judge, a man in the law. And he spent his whole life acquiring power and money and prestige. And one day he gets sick and he realizes that he focused on the wrong things in his life. He should have been focusing on love and friendship and faith and community, on the things that really matter and kind of evoke a transformation of yourself and in your loved ones. And he realizes this at the end of his life when he's dying. And I read that when I was 21 years old, and I thought to myself, my God, I was almost Ivan Ilyich. That's the path I wanted to go down. And I realized that, I fell in love with politics. I fell in love with philosophy. I fell in love with economics. And I realized that I wanted to share that love of learning with other young people. I wanted to have that kind of transformation of the mind and of the spirit that I had, and I wanted to be a vessel of that. So, I'm a Gen Xer. We watched way too much Dead Poets Society, John Keating and jumping on desks and, oh, Captain, my Captain, and Carpe Diem. But we really do believe in the transformative magic of education. And so that's why I remember when I told my dad that I wanted to be a high school teacher like he was, silence. Like I had said, Dad, I'm a serial killer. Would have been the same silence. He was so disappointed, but I think that he has since then become, very proud of the career that I've had. But it's an interesting journey. It's interesting because, I have a lot of friends who make a lot more money or, by traditional standards, you would say are a lot more successful. But I would say a successful life is where you spend every day somewhere where you would you wouldn't want to be anywhere else. Like you are where you want to be. Yeah. And that's where I am.
And it's funny you mentioned that because I think that is a sense that a lot of people have, and I don't know about Scott give you his opinion on this too, but to me, educators and their pay does not correlate to the value that it adds to society. I'm curious to hear you say that, obviously from your perspective, but to me, that's something that quite hasn't matched up yet. I'm starting to see it change a little bit. I think to me, just that correlation.
You know what I remember even from high school years and especially college, is that educators are not a homogeneous group.
No,
they are all created equal. Probably a lot like your students are all created a little differently, equal but differently. And in the idea to group them all and make blanket statements is kind of dangerous, because I remember having really passionate teachers and how transformative of an effect that had on me. And I'm really appreciative of that. To this day, I can name a few teachers who during high school years and college years just made that impact and turned on light switches in me that, I just didn't even know existed. Do we still have a lot of teachers like that? Are there still a lot of teachers in the education system that have not, maybe grown callous from a lot of the challenges that you guys face these days? And are there plenty of teachers out there with that same kind of passion that are flipping switches for kids today?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think teaching is just like any other profession. You have great lawyers and you have awful lawyers. You have great surgeons and terrible surgeons. You have idealists and people who are cynics. So, I think you have a little bit of everything. But I will tell you, though, that I really do believe in not just the power and the potency of a lot of my colleagues, but I do think that one of the things that I hope your listeners will understand, that if you don't work in an educational institution, you might not pick up on this. And it's that our schools do a lot more than just teach kids nowadays. I think when you're my age or maybe a little bit older, you think of schools as purely academic institutions. But one of the things I want people to understand is that schools now are the place where a lot of kids get 3 meals a day. Schools are where you get your emotional support. Schools are where sometimes you get your clothing needs met. And so the responsibilities that educational institutions have taken on in the time that I became a teacher to today, it's vast, it's profound. It's what we call wraparound services. And so, teachers are not just supposed to be academic figures. We're also supposed to be emotional figures and sometimes parental figures and act in loco parentis. And I don't necessarily think that's healthy, but when you ask teachers to carry a lot of the load to stand up because so many elements of society have stood down, I do have a kind of celebratory love of teachers and of schools. We do a lot of the things that our civil society doesn't do. As an example, when society shut down in March of 2020, I didn't hear a bunch of principals talking about the fact that students aren't going to be able to learn calculus. They were worried about the fact that a lot of their students weren't going to get meals. They were going to be calorie deficient. I mean, that really shows you a lot about how schools have been transformed and how we look to them to solve every single ailment that we have. When it comes to the family, when it comes to emotional health, when it comes to, education. Sometimes I say that, you have to do 10 things before you can even start teaching every day for a lot of our young people. I mean, I think that, when you teach at a school where a lot of the kids don't have a lot of privileges, you realize that a lot of them come from a background where the support that maybe you and I, the three of us, take for granted, they don't have it. And so schools have to provide it. So you're dang right. I'm a proud member of the educational community because we do a lot.
So those wraparound services now that have been developed over these years, is that the right approach to wrap that all into one person, the teacher who should be providing this? Or is that better separated back out to let a teacher specialize in teaching, maybe bring on more admin staff or special services staff that operate in the same organization, but just specialize in those other areas?
Well, no, teachers are not giving the meals.
Of course.
Yeah, but and not necessarily doing all the counseling, but school sites are. Right, holistically. Yeah. And I think, but if you want to kind of broaden the question, say, should schools be doing that?
Well, good point.
Is that what schools are supposed to be doing? And I think there's a difference between ideally, look at the influence that adults have or that teachers have in the lives of young people. It should not be the case that a teacher is the most important adult in the life of a child. It should not be it should be a mom or a dad. It should be a guardian. It should be a pastor. It should be a friend. But that's just simply not the America we live in today. And what's really difficult about it is statistically, if you look at the amount of time that a 5-year-old to an 18-year-old spends in school, they spend only 9% of their life in school. And yet we somehow expect that 9% that they spend in school to have this profound and colossal effect on their worldview and on the habits, which we all know are going to decide whether or not they're successful or not in their lives. And so we put a tremendous amount of pressure on that 9% that educators are actually present for. It's very stressful. And it's not a helpful sign. I don't see any optimism in saying the homes are doing less and less for our children and the schools have to do more and more. That's not a good thing at all. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is I think people who, if they were to read the book, they would be shocked at the extent to which young Americans, from all backgrounds, by the way, live their lives completely untethered to adult influences, adult voices, adult role models, adult expectations. They live their lives largely on their phones. The average teenager now spends up to 12 hours a day on their devices. And when they're engaging with their devices, they are not absorbing adult values. They're kids talking to other kids. It's casually vulgar, it's violent, it's sexual, it's usually very snarky and jaded. It's not a worldview that you would want your teenager absorbing, and yet that's where they spend their time. So there's just a real absence of adulthood in the lives of young people today.
I notice it when I meet young people, whether they be 8 years old or 18 years old, you can instantly tell somebody who has spent a lot of time probably around adults with that interaction and that challenge of, okay, I'm going to need to have a conversation. And then I think you can pretty quickly identify those who can't really put that together. Low eye contact, not much eye contact, right?
Exactly. Yep.
And you start to realize really quickly, okay, you've probably been stuck on that device, or just not having that adult interaction that was the role model that kind of showed you, here's how we behave. Here's how we behave amongst other people. Right?
And you said it right there. Here's how we fill in the blank.
Yeah.
And pretty much the big thesis of Hollowed Out is that the things that that we traditionally associate with a meaningful life, using our freedom to connect to somebody we love, a place we believe in, a God that we have faith in, friendship, reading, learning, all of these things that you
camaraderie,
community. Yeah. So like young people, they don't go to the movies, they don't go to football games. Half of all 18 to 35-year-olds in our country don't have a romantic partner. The desire for marriage and family is in free fall. 1 out of 5 millennials say they don't have a good friend in the entire world. Young people do not eat meals with their families the way that they used to. And so, we are creatures who learn by example. And we're either improved or depraved by the examples or the lack of examples in front of us. And so you put your finger right on it. This is how we fill in the blank. Well, imagine a whole generation that you've given them the keys to the car, but you haven't given them the license.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You've given them freedom to do whatever you want to do without giving them the wisdom to understand that you live a full and meaningful and happy life by using that freedom to connect to something you love more than you love yourself. And that's why they're cloistered, they're isolated, they're lonely. I've gone, I don't know what I told you. I think I've done something like 40 something interviews for the book now.
Yeah.
And, when some of the ones that are kind of bigger on a national level, you get trolled. I've never been trolled in my life before. People who, and the thing that really irks me, can I say the thing that irks me,
Please.
bothers me?
I want to hear.
Is this is just a get off my lawn book. Every generation thinks that the next one coming up is going to, just lead to ruin. I'm sorry. There is something uniquely worrisome about young Americans today. And you don't have to believe me. Look at how they feel about their own lives. Consider this. In the last 10 years, rates of suicide have gone up over 63%. Rates of self-harm have gone up by over 50% since 2012. The word that we hear all the time is anxiety, anxiety, and anxiety. And that is because young people do not have the connections in life that tend to give them a sense of purpose and meaning. You'd be miserable too if you didn't have a family connection, a faith connection, a community connection. If you spent 10 hours on your phone, you never read a book, you don't have any friends, heck yeah, you'd be miserable. And that was not the case. I've taught long enough to tell you this was not the case 15 or 20 or 25 years ago. Sure as heck when we went to BHS.
Right.
This was not the way we lived our lives, know? We went to the games. We went to the, we socialized. Nowadays, when I have time at the end of a class, maybe I say, you guys, we have a minute or two left. In our day, you talked, you gossiped, you flirted.
Straight to the phone.
Right.
Straight to the phone. And they're just self-medicated. There's no connection to a living, breathing human being, and it's making them miserable. It's making them hollowed out.
Yeah. Our BHS football games still fill up like they used to. So when you and I were in high school, you could not even get a seat, an open seat in Griffith Stadium, right? The thing is massive, and there was somebody in every spot up there. You could not even sit down.
I write about this in the book, that when I was... because it's a big football school, but you had to get there like the beginning of the JV game, right? Otherwise, or you had to have somebody save a seat for you. You were not going to get a seat. Yeah. And nowadays, you go and it's empty. And I'll even ask my students, I say, guys, this is BHS drill or football. Where are you on a Friday night? And they're like, they sound like a bunch of 50-year-olds. They're like, well, we're tired. It's the end of a week. We just want to kind of relax. And I said, well, don't you want to be with your friends? And here's what they say. Oh, we are. Yeah. We're just with our friends in our room by ourselves.
Digitally.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's the takeaway there, Jamie, is that it's not that football is everything, right? It's not even that Friday night. It doesn't even have to be that ritual or tradition. It's just that it is a huge indicator that tells you what they're spending their time on and what they're not spending their time on, like we were doing in generations past.
But when you go to a football game, you also learn how to mingle.
Oh, that's what it's all about, right? You might not even watch the football game, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely not. Like you go to the corner and you get your
you're over by the snack bar.
You gossip and you see the girl who you like, and you learn how to kind of talk to people and maybe talk to the parents of your friends and see your teachers. And the kids will say, well, it's just awkward. It's just awkward. Well, yeah, you got to learn how to be with other people. Yeah. And that's one of the things that bothers me about young people who don't date. Hey, guess what? Love is hard. Guess what? The big romance part, that lasts about 6 months of a marriage. And then you got to get serious, And but that's the good stuff of marriage. That's when you dig deep and you're like, okay, the idea that I'm here for you no matter what, and that you love me no matter what, that takes us a profound connection to another human being that they don't know how to forge. And so it really is something that worries me, not just, we can talk about the politics and how they have a very myopic and negative view of America. We can talk about that too if you want, but just their view of relationships and love and marriage. Why do it? Marriage just stifles my choices. It just makes me connected to things. I don't want to change diapers. I don't want to have to do this or do that or consider somebody else's opinion. And so I think they're growing up in an era of radical individualism. Mm-hmm. And that's great when you're 17, but it ain't so great when you're 35 and lonely.
I think we should get this a lot more, but I want to take a step back real quick because it's a kind of overlapping theme. And what you said about the wraparound services that you see in education or at school sites. Scott, I think you were with me on the podcast, maybe not, when we interviewed Bakersfield Chief Terry. Were you with me on that one?
I was not, no.
Okay, so we ultimately had a very similar discussion. He said what police officers are asked to do nowadays to deal with mental health, to deal with homelessness, things that traditionally weren't in the job description of being a officer enforcing the law, protecting and serving the community. It's gone into this now where we're dealing with homelessness, we're dealing with mental health. And so I kind of see an analogy in what's happening with school with younger people. So my question for both of you, or if you have an opinion on this, is so what's happening from a societal standpoint that's causing two different, obviously, institutions, but ultimately having to accomplish more and do things that they weren't intended to do?
Well, I think if you want to take this to a very, very basic level of mean, you majored in philosophy, right?
Poli-sci and philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. So from a philosophical standpoint, I mean, you can go all the way back to the, political writings of Plato and Aristotle, who understood that you can't have a just society unless you have virtuous individuals, that morality rocks the cradle of civilization. I mean, the root word of civilization is civility. And as people don't know how to govern themselves, as they can't take care of themselves and their families, as they don't have the habits, the values, or the behaviors that allow them to be self-sufficient, government has to grow to take care of that, right? So the way I look at it is, if I teach a classroom full of students who are respectful, they value education, they know how a classroom is supposed to work, I don't have to be a strong teacher, right? I don't have to worry about behavior issues and sending you to the dean and having all of these rules and doing all of these things. I can just get up there and teach because I trust you guys. You know how to use your liberty. I think the problem now is that liberty has degenerated into licentiousness, that we give people liberty, but we don't give them the value system and the morality and the institutions that imbue young people with those value systems of how to use their freedom well are just simply missing. I mean, when you look at the dissolution of family life, even in what you would call, traditional two-parent families, we don't eat together anymore. You have this phenomenon called absentee parenting, where parents are there, but they're distracted. They're on their phones. They're taking videos of themselves. They're taking a selfie of themselves eating a meal and then put it on Instagram rather than actually putting the phone down and talking to their kids. And so I think I take it down to a very basic level, which is that we are not imbued with the values and the behaviors that allow us to use our freedom well. And that's why.
That's why I was going to echo that. It all starts at the home. It all starts in inability to take care of yourself and your own family means someone else has to step in. And in this situation, various government institutions, entities, and so happens that teaching and police are getting the brunt of it, in my opinion.
And I think that to a certain degree, if you go back, I don't want to get too nerdy here, but if you go back to the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate, right? The Anti-Federalists said, look, we don't want to have this Constitution that gives the national government all of these powers, because we want to focus, real freedom happens locally, where we can govern ourselves. If somebody's going to write a law, I want to be able to talk to them at the store about it because I passed this person in the street, right? That's how you hold government accountable. Mm-hmm. Same thing with families. Like if your kid's going nuts, I want to know the family whose kid is beating up the other kid. Localism is how we create responsibility, knowing your neighbor. But so much of that connective tissue of our lives is now gone. There's now this phenomenon where people don't want to volunteer to coach soccer. They don't want to volunteer to coach football. All these parents, and I'm guilty of this, who sign their kid up for a sport, but nobody wants to be the volunteer, right? So that connective tissue that kind of informs and domesticates is just not there. And the young people are living it out.
What's funny, Jeremy, is it's happening in business too, right? So everything is getting more. There's an app for that. There's a 1-800 number for that. Everything is going in that direction. And I'm constantly preaching to people that you need to work with somebody where their reputation is on the line. And you do that with face-to-face discussions, knowing the person who you're dealing with. It needs to be a local person so that they have something on the line. Yeah. And that way, when they're providing you a service, they are accountable to you about that. They're not just somebody on the other end of this 800 number that you'll never talk to again. And I see people migrating to trying to transact more and more very big business, like buying a home or getting a home loan, some of the biggest transactions that you'll do in your life. And then they're trying to put those in a box that's just turns into push button on an app or a quick telephone conversation with somebody on a 1-800 number, and it just doesn't work that way. These big decisions that people make in their lives need to be handled by somebody who you can have a face-to-face with. Yeah. Go get to know them. I want to, my family knows your family. That's why I'm not going to let you down on this transaction, So I think as the kids that are coming out of high school and college now, if they have not had that kind of interaction where that's how you do things, you go see a person, you go talk to them, you find out who you can trust, who can you work with, it's going to be really interesting to see how do they transact business in the next couple decades. Are they going to gravitate more and more to this push button kind of services because that's how they've always interacted with everyone? I can't imagine that's going to be the result.
That's such a good point. We have deified convenience, haven't we? Mm-hmm. Right.
100%.
But there's a cost there. Right, there's a cost to not knowing your insurance agent. Right, there's a cost to not knowing the people who are handling the business and the commerce of your life. And this is why I'm not a huge fan of online learning. I want to have skin in the game. I want to look in the eyes of my students and find out, are you engaged in this? Because like when you're on the other side of a screen and I don't even see you, there's no way for me to have that impact, to know if I'm actually teaching you. And there's no way for me to hold you accountable. Like you said, you have to be accountable if you know people. And so, when I think of the technology, I always say that, I never want an administrator to come in and judge a teacher if that administrator didn't teach in this era of cell phones, where everything is impersonal. They're constantly distracted. And that, to me, there's kind of this kind of chasm around 2012, 2015, where every single thing changed in their lives. And I don't blame technology for everything. I think we have a culture of radical individualism, and that's the fire. But we threw gasoline on it with the technologies.
Yeah, it's almost like it kind of pulled that out, that tendency. Maybe it's out of laziness, or maybe it's out of kind of like shiny object syndrome, right? But technology did tend to fuel that fire and kind of bring out maybe the worst of that extreme of us that we didn't know we had the ability to do until we had the technology to facilitate it.
And what's interesting is they know that it's making them miserable, by the way. I mean, it's interesting. Usually...
It's just like, people who are alcoholics or drug addicts, they know it's having an adverse effect, but they still do it. And
it's also kind of like, just because, and if you asked a drug addict or somebody who's an alcoholic, do you feel like you have freedom to do whatever you want to do? The answer would be no. Because real freedom, getting back to the Greeks, the Greeks understood that real freedom is not just simply doing whatever you want to do. It's having the character to be the man or woman you want to be. And that's what we've lost, is that kind of more mature, nuanced view of individual freedom. Because, it's one thing to say, well, the gate is open, go play tennis. It's another to say, well, I've put in the hours and hours. I have the skills where I can go play tennis well. So we simply think, well, you're 18, go do what you want. You'll have a full life. But they have no idea. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have the relational knowledge of how to do that.
This may sound naive, but I go, to see Joe Rogan's stand-up comedy, right? And before I go to my seat, I have this little pouch I have to put my phone in, zipped up. I get it when I'm done. And at first I was like, this is annoying. But then, of course, you're so much more present and enjoy it. Has that been talked about at schools? You step on school if you have a phone, you don't get it until you leave campus.
Every teacher has their own policy. Right. But my policy is I'd like to think a funny way of describing it. When you guys all have kids, right? And when you potty train, the 2-year-old says, Daddy, I need to go number 1. We know what you need to do. And when they say, Daddy, I need a number 2, we know what they need to do. And so I tell my students, look, if you need a number 1 or number 2, you're high school kids, get up and go to the bathroom, right? Because it's a natural thing. They have to do it. It's a compulsion. We all know what it's like to have to go to the bathroom. For this generation, there's a number 3. And the number 3 is I have to look at my phone. Like I've got to see it. Do I have a tweet? Do I have a text? Do I have a Snapchat? Right? They have to and so I tell the kids, I don't want to see your phones. I don't want them on the desk. But if you absolutely have to look at it, just get up and go. You know what? I don't want to know if it's 1 or 2 or 3. But when you're in my room, I want all of you. I'm greedy. I don't just want you physically here. I want you mentally here. And when you have your phone on they don't mean anything by it, but they are perpetually, it's a distracted generation. Math teachers always assign a lot of homework. Like you have to be a math teacher most of the time. But, some of my math teacher friends will say, I'm assigning what I think is 1 hour of work. And the kids will come back and say, oh my God, that was 5 hours. And what you're realizing is that young people cannot focus on something more than 10 minutes. And they think they look at their phone for a minute or 2, but really they're looking at it for 10 or 20 minutes. Yeah. So what should take an hour is taking, hours and hours and hours. That's exactly right.
So can that not be something done on a campus level? Like no phone policy, period.
No, again, I don't know why, but they say for safety reasons, kids have to be able to have their phones.
People exist without phones before, I promise.
You're not going to get an argument from me, but that's, so in my classroom, I feel like I do a decent job saying, I don't want to see them. Just off and away. If you have to do it, go take a call, go outside. But different schools have it where, like I know in Texas, they have like little cubby holes, and you have to turn it in before you go in there. But
because if you're limited in the classroom, right, you're still. Getting back to probably some of the themes of your book. Okay, so a teacher's good at making sure it's not present in the classroom. But what happens when they go to recess or to lunch, and then they don't engage anymore? And so it's a cycle of.
That's a great point.
So why not just let's nip in the butt?
They say that students have to be able to, if there was an emergency, they have to be able to contact their parents. But
don't you have there's admin for that, right? If I need to get home with my kid, I call the principal, right?
I agree.
Hey, pull out LF from class. There's an emergency, and I'm there.
When you take the phones away from young people, they freak out
temporarily.
Yeah, but they freak out. The bathroom requests go But if it's close by, I find that they can handle it. But if you take it away, it's like lopping off an appendage.
Yes, I would agree, but
Yeah.
temporarily. And I'm not saying I'm perfect with this. I have 3 young girls. And when my youngest, when I know her attitude and her behavior is changing, I know it's because she spent too much time on her iPad.
exactly right. Yep.
And I take it away, and you would thought I had just taken one of
Oh,
her arms.
absolutely.
But 45 minutes, hour, however long that is later, she's fine, and it doesn't happen again until she's on it too much. So,
Yeah.
Maybe preaching to the choir, but this to me is an easy fix. Grab it. Can't have it when you leave school. Here you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to a lot of young people, that is everything to them. That is their portal to the outside world. That is how they communicate with their friends. That is how they get a sense of self-esteem. I don't know if you guys saw this, but they just came out with the fact that Instagram and Facebook has been aware for years.
I read that.
That they're really hurting the mental health of young,
yes.
especially young girls and body
girls.
image issues. Social media is sometimes weaponized. Again, the girls will sometimes take a picture of themselves at a party and they'll tag somebody in it. And it's not that they care that they're at a party, but they're trying to show somebody else out there that you weren't invited. You weren't here, which, I mean, we've all been that, right? Where you've not been included and it makes you feel bad. So, I mean,
It used to take a lot longer to figure it out, though, right?
Oh yeah, you had to, hold on. There was
Snow mill, right?
there was a party out in the field on Friday night. Why wasn't I invited?
Yeah. We learn
now
on
it's-
Monday.
Yeah, but now it's absolutely instant. But to me, what bothers me the most, and I don't want to sound like a kind of over the top teacher, but like I think of, I've been teaching for 24 years. It's hard for me to describe this, but there are moments that are pure ecstasy in a teaching career. Once in a while, if you're lucky, you'll have a moment in a classroom where it's not about the grades, it's not about the tests, that you're talking about something that is so important to the young people, to their lives, to maybe the human condition itself, that you realize that this is a memorable moment, that it's a transformative moment. It's something where you can kind of summon that which is best in all of us. And it's the kind of moments you live for as a teacher. And they don't come along very often. And I have found, and maybe I'm just not as good of a teacher as I used to be, but I have found that it's harder and harder and harder to have those enchanting, grandiose moments because you have to be completely invested in the possibilities of the classroom to have that happen. And I miss those moments. They can't be artificially created. As a result of that, what we do in the classroom doesn't feel as consequential. It does feel like half the time, we're just giving the material and you're going to forget it because, really you're focused on something that's in your backpack and on a screen. And so, I mean, I'm somebody who, books have changed my lives. Teachers have changed my lives. I believe in the absolute metamorphosis of the soul that can happen because of the power of one class or one book or one teacher. I find that our culture and our technologies and our value systems today get in the way of that. And it's frustrating. I mean, that's why I wrote Hollowed Out, is because you're going to have an entire generation of young people who really have a very limited sense of what's possible. Who are playing video games instead of climbing mountains, who don't want to connect to anybody instead of fall in love. I mean, you are more likely to read a book in this country at the age of 13 than at 17. I mean, just think of all the good stuff in life and now get rid of it and expect that to be a substantive childhood. It's not going to happen.
I guess it takes me to my question. I was going to ask you what led you to write the book, and I think you kind of answered it with your last statement. Is it what you saw in the classroom? Is it the change?
Great question. Yeah, it's interesting. These kids will say things. You're like, well, that's kind of weird. Like I've taught American civics because I'm a unapologetic, bleeding heart romantic of this country. And in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, kids have started to talk about America and American history in a way that I'm like, well, that's different. I've never heard that before. That's weird. That's very cynical. And then they start talking about the way they spend their time, like no football games. I noticed nobody really, people go to formals and proms, but they go in groups. They're not going with a boyfriend or girlfriend. You ask them about, things like religion. It's none of my business if my students are religious or not, because I'm a public school teacher. What bothers me is how profoundly ignorant they are. It's not just that they're not religious or don't have any faith. They don't know anything about religion. I'll never forget a very powerful moment I had a few years ago where I mentioned something about Easter vacation or something. And I said to them, do you guys even know what Easter represents? And they kind of looked at me and said, well, okay, do you know what the resurrection is? Half of my students had no idea what the resurrection was. So, I don't care if they're Christian or Buddhist or Jewish or Muslim or atheist, but you should at least know.
Knowledge is
You should know what Buddha's noble truths are. You should know what reincarnation and nirvana is. You should know what the Sermon on the Mount is promising you. So what are the options for a full and meaningful life? I mean, people who are truly faithful from their head to their toes will talk about a kind of joie de vivre, a joy of life that they can't access anywhere in the physical world. Shouldn't the kids at least be aware that some people experience that? They know nothing about it, so many of them. And so, they don't go to church, don't know anything about religion, don't eat meals together anymore. And so it's funny, I notice these things. I'm like, well, maybe it's just me. So I talk to my colleagues and like, oh no, absolutely. It's not just happening in your classroom. And then you do the research and you realize these things are happening countrywide. So when you read Hollowed Out, it always starts with like kind of my experiences in the classroom, but then you realize it's not just me. This is a generation that is being hollowed out. And, I think that if you really, I'm not saying that China and Iran aren't problems. I'm not saying that the national debt is not a problem, but I'm telling you right now that in America, you cannot skip a generation. You can't have one single generation that doesn't understand the values that make democracy and self-government work. Lincoln in the 1840s gave us this great speech that nobody reads anymore. It's called his Lyceum Address. And he says, every generation of young men and women have to understand what the founders sacrificed. Like, what did it mean in June of 1776 to become a traitor to the British Empire? I mean, what kind of risk were they taking to create the first liberal democracy in the history of the world? Like, these men did these things, and they took tremendous risk. And by the way, they were young.
Very
Thomas
young,
Jefferson
right?
was,
Early 20s.
Yeah, a lot of these guys were late 20s. Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. John Adams was younger than me. He was 44 when he was arguing in the Second Continental Congress. George Washington, when he was the head of the Continental Army, was a middle-aged man. Hamilton was in his 20s at the Constitutional Convention. Madison in his 20s. I mean, they were making it up to create this extraordinary empire of liberty. You have to understand what those values are and where they came from. It is so difficult to build a civilization and workable institutions. It is so easy to destroy them. And that's why Lincoln said you have to understand the sacrifices, and that's how we perpetuate freedom. Well, let me tell you something. We're not perpetuating freedom.
Is it not being taught?
I don't think that it's not only is it not being taught, I think that they have a view of different, so for instance, I think the three of us in this room right now, we understood that America has always had a gap between our ideals and our reality. Especially early on.
Of course.
Right? I mean, the original sin on the conscience of this country is slavery. But we would say the real America is not our mistakes. It's the 13th Amendment and the Civil War, right? And the Emancipation Proclamation. The real America is not 100 years of segregation. It's Martin Luther King and Letter from a Birmingham Jail and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment. That the real America is not our sins. It's how we make up for those sins to live up to the creed that is this country. I think a lot of young people will look at our worst moments and say, that's the real America. Don't ask me to pledge to that. Don't ask me to sing a national anthem to that. Look what this country has done. And older Americans tend to be very patriotic because their view is, look where we came from. Look what we have achieved. Look at this soaring ideal that no other society has ever dreamt of espousing. We birthed it, we created it, we spread it, and look how far we have come. A true multicultural liberal democracy, that happens nowhere in the world, okay? The achievement of America is unrivaled. And yet, I think a lot of young people don't see that. They see everything that's wrong because we do have a country that is mired in a problematic history. You can't deny it. And they look at that and say, that's the real America.
So I would say
does that make sense?
It does, Jeremy. And I would actually take it one step further and say that it's really unreasonable to expect us to ever reach our ideals because there will probably always be a gap between what is reality and what our ideals are. Let's get our heads wrapped around that and understand that of course, that's the target. That's what we're working towards, and that's healthy. But it's unhealthy to think that we would actually be able to reach our ideals because even if we were to, we probably will move the bar on ourselves and say, hey, we could be a little better. Let's move our ideals out to this other point, this other summit that we want to ascend. And so I think getting our heads wrapped around that, I also think that the individual is kind of a microcosm of what you're talking about as well, because even as we live our lives, I think there's a huge reality gap between my ideals, my personal ideals, and what my reality is, but I'm trying, I'm working. And so I think that the same way that we look at ourselves as individuals and try to overcome the fact that we're falling short of our ideals, but we're working on it, I think that there is kind of an approach that you can have to that on the individual level. And then maybe that's what's being reflected too at the more national level, is that somewhere we did go from understanding that, having our heads wrapped around it and being okay with that, but still working towards what we're working towards. And now it has sort of turned into a little bit of self-hatred maybe, and, kind of self-blame that, you know, I'm not going to be able to overcome this, and I'm such, you know, we're falling short, and so therefore we're some kind of bad society. I really don't think we are. I think that we're a great society trying to be greater and falling a little short of it, and historically we have, but we're working on it.
And we always will, by the way.
And we always will.
Right? I mean, I do think that there is a certain status that young people associate with self-loathing, that, oh, you know, if you hate yourself enough that then you get it, you know, that you're fully aware of, you know, kind of your limits. But what I would say to you is, let me defend the young people, even though I don't agree with them in a lot of this. I think what they would say, and I mean, you and I would say to them, and I think we're right, that being patriotic is not the same thing as saying your country's perfect. Right?
100%.
Yeah, a statement of patriotism is not a statement of perfection. But I think what they would say, and it's an idealistic position, they would say, look, if you look at American history and you look at all the racial and class and gender terror that people have had to endure in this country, the violence, the injustice, all of it. I do think these are young people who would say, we want to make it very clear that we are not okay with it. Right? And if that means we need to tear down some statues, if that means we need to rename some schools, if that means we need to not venerate the monuments, then that's okay with us, right? But we just want to be very clear that we're not okay with what these people in the past have done. Now, of course, the problem with that is it is an absolutely la-la land standard, right? I mean, and it also is a very arrogant standard because it assumes that they are the first generation in human history to have perfect, you know, justice in their consciousness, right? As if they are somehow omnisciently above history rather than in the stream of history, right? I mean, as I say to them, look, guys, in 200 years, you are going to look really, really bad. They're going to look at a variety of your opinions and actions and think you are just this step away from evil.
Deplorable, I think.
Yeah, you will be deplorable in their eyes, and you might not even know what it is you're doing right now, right?
Right.
So, you know, just be very mindful because it's really, really hard. There's no words to describe how hard this is to really take a historic figure, let's say somebody like Andrew Jackson in the 1820s, to really understand their world, everything about it, the way they looked at religion and history and Christianity and culture, and I mean, everything. To really understand all that would take a titanic effort. It's just easier to look back and say, well, your views were different, therefore you're bad. I mean, I'll never forget this. I was talking about how I think Grant is an underappreciated American. Great American. I read that 900-page Ron Chernow biography of Grant. And so I had Grant on the mind. And one of the things they love to do is you mention an American and they'll just, one line, they're like, oh, you mean the alcoholic? I mean, just, okay, well, yeah, he was an alcoholic, but he also won the Civil War.
After 900 pages of detail about his history that even probably falls short of really who he was, even, right? And that's the one line.
And what kind of, you can get that on a phone real fast, right? Yeah. So you mentioned Bill Clinton. I happen to think Bill Clinton was a very good president who could have been great, but I think a lot of achievements in the 1990s. And they'll say, oh, you mean the Monica Lewinsky guy, or the guy who started the school to prison pipeline. Right, or you'll say Thomas Jefferson. Of course, lots of racial issues there. Yeah. So you mentioned.
How when you say Donald Trump, what do they say about that typically?
I don't say much about Donald Trump, but it's interesting how. Here's something. You'll find this interesting. I mentioned Ronald Reagan the other day, and he's now not fashionable because they say he didn't respond to the AIDS crisis fast enough. Which is true, but I mean, from a 2021 perspective, that looks very different than 1982.
Well, and having lived through the Ronald Reagan era, I think that we have a much different understanding, right? And so if that's now the one-liner, that's how history will describe him. I mean, that's kind of shame, isn't it? I mean, after everything that went on in the 1980s, I mean,
that was a successful two-term presidency. Yeah. Not perfect, of course, none of them are, but that's what they do is that they have, they know something about you, and then that's it. Teddy Roosevelt, the imperialist. Martin Luther King, he cheated on his wife. I mean, it goes on and on and on. None of us can stand up to that standard. And that's my point is, I understand where they're coming from, but it's not helpful.
What are they comparing to? I mean, is there a country or a period in our world's history that I don't know about that was this utopia that was perfectly just? What is it that they're saying they're striving to be? Is it something that is America just hasn't reached it yet, which we probably would all agree to some extent? Or is it some other idea or philosophy or system of governments or something that's been better than this? What are they pointing to when they say that? Because I could tell you some stories right now of things that are going on in, say, China, for example, and if they actually knew about that or read anything about what's going on, they would say, oh, wait, that's going on right now in 2021? So
Finland.
Okay. Let's go to Finland.
I'm joking a little bit, but they do. I mean,
let's move. We're moving.
Yeah, the ones who are more informed, they will look at these Scandinavian countries and talk about these, socialist democrat societies, and why don't we do that? And look how great and awesome those are. But most of the time, that's your question led to a big fight I had with my oldest daughter before. And I've gotten to a point with my oldest daughter, and she'll never listen to this podcast, so I can talk about her a little bit. We've gotten to the point where we just can't talk politics anymore. And I really do believe that the social media at a young age, this is a mistake. And people are going to think that the book Hollowed Out was my frustrations as a teacher. It's also my failures as a father. Mistakes. I wish I'd taken the devices away. Yeah. I wish I hadn't given it to her when she was in junior high. She used to be a great reader. She stopped reading and just social media and video. I mean, they're all algorithms too. So if you like a video, you watch the same thing over and over and over and over again, and just pounds you for her about how awful America was and how awful it is. And so your question I've asked you a million times, like, well, okay, fine. What's better? Why do you think people are coming here? The most important voting you do with your body is not your finger, it's with your feet. And people come to this country because things can happen here that don't happen anywhere else, that didn't happen on accident. There are men and women in this country and in its history that sacrificed to create these institutions, to create these opportunities, to be a beacon that people outside of this country seem to understand that you, my daughter, don't get. Yeah. And that drives me crazy, because the least you can do is be respectful of the people who sacrificed so much to give you so much. And yet all you do is take a snotty kind of disposition of, well, your views on da-da-da-da are not what mine are in 2021, and therefore I will show no appreciation. It drives me crazy. And so, no, I mean, she never has an answer for that, but neither do I. I mean, I again, when you say things like 1 out of 5 millennials see the flag as a symbol of hatred, I mean, that's coming from somewhere.
Sure.
That's coming from somewhere. Yeah. When you have a majority of 18 to 29-year-olds who have a more favorable opinion of socialism than capitalism. I mean, you're younger than I am, but you're not. That drives me up the wall, because we grew up during the Cold War.
That's right.
Right? I mean, we grew up looking at Eastern Europe. We grew up looking at Central Latin America. I mean, we watched these things.
They need to have a conversation with somebody who has immigrated here from Ukraine.
Like today.
Who's just recently come from these countries, and listen to their message about, why did I come here? Because that is not the way you want to be. That's not the kind of government you want to live under. It's just amazing that the younger generation here will be working to promote that direction when people are literally fleeing that direction, coming here to find freedom. Just amazing.
Well, and I would even and I would even broaden it even more. If you look at just the scope of human history, we are living in a ridiculously rare time. Like, our lives are taking place in this rare moment of history where freedom is the rule, not oppression, where prosperity is taken for granted, where pluralism is possible, where tolerance is widespread. Consider it this way. If you didn't know...
I mean, the abundance of food and clean water, basic...
The basic things we take for granted. You have 1 billion people in the world today who don't have access to clean drinking water today. And so if you didn't know what society you were going to be born into, where in that society and when, and yet you ended up being born in America in the year 2004... You've won the lottery.
Absolutely.
You've won the lottery, and you don't know it. You think that you're living through the worst possible of times. And that's the other thing I get. I'm going to rage a little bit here. The other criticism I get is they'll say, well, these young people are miserable, not because they're not connected to meaningful things. They're miserable because of climate change. They're miserable because of this, or because of all the oppression that they suffer from. Okay. I don't think that's why the student in front of me can't have a discussion.
Yeah.
I don't think that's why they're lonely. I think they have a ridiculous view of how bad things are, because, it used to be 1,000 years ago, you only knew what was happening in your village. Nowadays, every bad thing in the world they can see on their phone immediately, and it gives them the impression that the world's falling apart, even though you are less likely to die of war than at any time in history. You are more likely to live in a democracy. You're more likely to have religious and speech and due process rights than at any point in human history. I mean, if you could vote to be born in a place and a time, you would be silly not to be born now in a Western liberal society. Sorry.
Well, and that soundbite, or that one line sentence that you get about whatever's going on in the world, or that bad thing that's happening, you only get that little 8-word phrase to describe what's really going on when really there's a lot more going on. Why do you only get that little phrase? Is because you got to get on to the next headline. So it's just headline, soundbite.
Negative.
Right down the line, right? And then, okay, now I'm up to date on everything. But really, in reality, you do lack all the perspective that's required to really have a grasp and understanding of what's really going on. And really, nobody could be an expert on all these things. But I think what I keep hearing, and the theme that I do hear you preach, is that we have lost the ability to teach our young people the value of having perspective, and that things are all relative, and that you've got to know your history. You've got to know a little something about everything to have a really good, well-rounded understanding and be able to evaluate those little one-line sentences of something going on in some faraway land or here domestically. You're not going to have the perspective to evaluate that unless you do have a well-rounded education. You've read a few things, you know a little bit of history, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And in fact, it's funny you say that because, today I was just saying to the kids, because, our levels of trust in American government are so low today. I mean, we have the lowest levels. People don't trust our institutions. They don't trust banks. They don't trust hospitals. They don't trust schools. They don't trust churches. I mean, just the basic level of distrust in civil society makes it very difficult to function. And yet I said to the kids, think about all the people that worked hard today to keep these lights on. Think about the fact that somebody's delivering your mail today. Think about the fact that your water is clean. Think about the fact that there's somebody patrolling the streets so that you are safe. Think about the fact that almost all of the planes, probably every single plane in the world today will land safely. And yet, as George Will, the famous columnist, said, if you're a journalist or a reporter, your job is not to report on all the planes that land. And yet for most kids, most days, all of those planes are landing, but you focus on the one mishap and you characterize that as the totality of your experience. Of course, you'd have a hollowed out view of your life and of your country.
Great conversation, but I don't want to sound like dads shitting on younger kids, younger generations, right? The old guy saying that. So what message of hope do you have in the book? What message of how do we fix this? How do we get out of this? What message of change do you have? I want to focus on something positive.
Yeah, no, here's the thing. We all know what the solution is, and the kids want to do it. We've spent a long time today talking about the devices, right? The last week of high school, because I teach seniors, I always ask the kids, okay, imagine you could go back to your freshman year, to your first week, and you could talk to your 14-year-old self. What would you say? And I actually have this story in the book. The valedictorian 3 or 4 years ago said, this is easy. I would go back to my 14-year-old self and I would tell myself, go up to the bluffs, take your phone and throw it off. And everybody shook their head yes. Everybody knows it's a distraction. Everybody knows they're miserable. So they know it. The young people know that it is such, as you said before, if you put it away for a little while, you kind of find this joy. You kind of, you rage for a minute and then it goes away. And you kind of find that mountaintop a lot easier. The second thing I would say is that young people really do have an epic sense of what's possible. They do not have a parochial view of what can be achieved. They have kind of global views of we can get to a clean environment, that we can save the planet. We can get people to eat differently, and they're willing to sacrifice for it. My students, you know what? They will eat differently. They will act differently because that is an ideal that they believe in. And you know what? When they're marching in the streets, they might not know it, but they're marching for Jeffersonian liberal ideals. What's so fascinating about young people is they are thoroughly American in their souls, but have an inability to articulate that in their mouths, right? So they do have an American view of justice. They just don't know that it's an American view of justice. They believe in natural law. They believe in inalienable rights. They believe in the Declaration of Independence, the 14th Amendment, and Martin Luther King's dream. They just have trouble articulating that sometimes. So they're right. We're right there. Families want to eat together more. They just don't do it. So we know what to do. We want to do it. We just, again, the reason I wrote the book was hoping that more people would be exposed to this and say, you know what, I'm going to make a few incremental changes to our lives. And a little incrementalism from a lot of people yields large changes.
One thing I will say before, Scott, you get to wrapping this up is that's important. I think you're right. But we are seeing things happen in society where conversations like this aren't happening as much. You're seeing a point where people can't disagree. They can't debate. And so I know you said they want this, they know, they understand, and they don't understand what they know. But we may be slowly taking that away as a society when if you say something that is not the flavor of the day, you risk of getting your medium canceled.
I'm very careful how I teach now. I don't have lots of discussions about public policy issues because you have to watch it. So yeah, I mean, I think, you can disagree without being disagreeable. Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. But yeah, no, I do agree that we have to learn how to have difficult conversations because at the end of the day in this country, progress is about consensus and coalition. It's not about one side getting its way and destroying the other half of the country who disagrees. That's just not how it happens in a pluralistic society. So yeah.
So with your book Hollowed Out, so this is your third book, right?
Yes.
And the other
But
two...
it's the first popular book. I mean,
okay.
Yeah, the other two were just kind of for teachers and kind of pedagogy and, here's how to deal with certain issues when you're in the classroom. This is a mainstream popular, I wanted to appeal to everybody.
And that's what I wanted to ask you was, who is the target audience for this book? Because I know you've kind of written books for teachers, and I know that this book would be very valuable for teachers and parents, and so is it more targeted towards parents? Could a 16-year-old pick this up and find some value in it? So when you were writing this, who were you writing to? Who needs to read this in order to have this understanding of what's going on and how to possibly solve it?
Well, I mean, I wrote it. I mean, I know I probably should admit this on a podcast it's going to be listened to, but I wrote it to be popular. I mean, I wrote it because I think it's a message that resonates with everybody who cares about this country.
Okay.
I mean, anybody who's going to hire Gen Zers in the future, even if you don't have kids, people who care about education, even if you're not a teacher. So, I mean, this really is about the future of our civilization. It's about about an entire generation and how to save them from the hollowness that they are experiencing in their own lives. So, obviously, if I had to pick, teachers and parents and people who care about kind of the trappings of culture. But I really did write this for everybody to read, and that's why I've worked, my publisher. We can have a whole nother podcast someday about how ridiculously hard it is to get a book published by a big national publisher when you're a nobody like me. If you're Ben Shapiro or you're Barack Obama, it's not a big deal. You're an instant bestseller. But when you teach civics at Bakersfield High School and CSU-B, getting a huge national publisher to put the money into the book and to promote it and to pay you and all of this, it is a adventure of self-loathing, let me tell you.
So that is a whole discussion, and I've had some discussions with people lately who have ventured into that or tried and really not had much success. I wanted to get into that today, and we're kind of running short on time. So, fine. But actually, there's that and a few other questions I have for you that we'd love to have you back sometime and maybe just continue this discussion. And then, being a local author who has had that success and actually gotten this book out at that level, it'd be great to hear that process.
I would be more than happy to. And it is kind of it's a unique experience because I'm just a high school teacher, and yet when you go on to I did a podcast with Newt Gingrich and who's the governor of Arkansas who won the Iowa caucus in 2008, Mike Huckabee. When you go on Fox and Friends, or you go on with Laura Ingraham, or I had my book reviewed in the New York Post, so you get these kind of weird national hits. And it is weird when people come after you a little bit who haven't even read the book, by the way. If you go into Amazon, you can tell people who just give it 1 star and say, well, this is just a screed against never even reading the book.
Right.
And so it's a weird experience. It's been fun. It's been exhilarating. It's been my dream for 2 decades to have a big national book. But it is kind of it's weird. It's not quite what you think it is. It's really hard. I was giving at one point 6 or 7 interviews a day on the radio.
Really?
New York and Charlotte and Sacramento and Austin, Texas, and I was just sitting in my room doing Zoom interviews for podcasts and radio. It's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting.
I think what's unique about it too, Jeremy, is that it is coming from an educator in the education system. It's not necessarily a rail against the education system at all.
It's not a rail against the kids either.
Or the kids either.
It's really you and me I'm criticizing.
And really, that's what I wanted to stress was that it's actually just a statement of the facts and then some suggestions about what can be done to try to change our course. And the course that we're on is just not a very good course, and it needs to be corrected.
And I say this in the introduction of Hollowed Out, that, there's not a lot of, if you're trying to be famous and rich being a teacher, you're in the wrong profession.
Yeah.
But there is one cool thing that we have, and that is sometimes we see kind of these embryonic changes a little bit before everybody else does. Mm-hmm. And so, the book is really me screaming as loud as I can on behalf of teachers in America saying, look, guys, this is not a get off my lawn book. It's not being grumpy. There really are seismic, almost, spiritual, intellectual, political changes that are uniquely worrisome. Yeah. And you need to know what they are. And so the book is very readable. It's only 120 pages long. And it's just trying to really vividly explain, here's what I see. The research is backing up what we see. It's not just us in Bakersfield.
Yeah.
And here's what we can do about it.
Jeremy, before we wrap, we do something kind of fun. We kind of rapid fire you with a few questions. So
Absolutely.
if you don't mind, I'll fire away. So what's a
Do I have to be serious or do I have to?
You can answer any way you like.
Okay,
This is our
okay.
2 Cents podcast. We like to have fun. But probably on a serious level, what's a quote that you live by? What's something that you maybe that you've heard or read somewhere that has hit you enough to where you live by this?
There's a French writer who invented the essay named Michel de Montaigne, and he had my favorite quote on education, which is that I study the thoughts of others to know my own mind better. And I try and live by that. I try and understand that there are geniuses out there. Mm-hmm. There are people who have walked and done things that I can't even imagine. And by reading and learning, I can absorb their wisdom. And it's something I try and live by.
You know, somehow that's related to, in a weird way, I'm trying to put my finger on it, but the concept of you learn best or you know the subject best when you're able to teach it. It seems like there's a little bit of connection to that quote.
Yeah, I always
there.
tell the kids were, Mr. Adams, what should I do to study for the test? Teach it to your parents. Teach it to get 2 or 3 kids, get some pizza, and teach the unit beginning to end to one another. Yeah.
All right, next up is who has been your biggest mentor?
Probably my dad. You know, my father was a teacher and you know, always stressed excellence and no excuses. And, you know, I mean, I grew up watching students adulate my father, you know, really understood that he opened doors for them, not because, and this is the thing that's interesting, I write about this in the book too, is that, you know, no student has ever come back and thanked a teacher because they were being nice, you know? Sometimes they're nice, but they thank them because they had high expectations.
Great point, Jeremy.
Right?
Yeah,
I mean, they thanked them not because, oh, you understood why I couldn't work hard. No, I understand that you had hurdles in your life, but I still believed in you. And I really believe that the worst thing you can do for a young person is tell them it's okay to fail.
Yeah.
If you don't want to study, if you don't want to work hard, if you don't want to give a crap, that's okay. You have an excuse and go ahead and play that card. My dad never did that. He didn't care where you came from. He believed in your ability to achieve excellence. And I've always kind of absorbed that.
Yeah. Let's see. Next up is what book would you recommend people read, or maybe what book do you gift, or what book do you recommend on a regular basis?
There are a few books. Obviously, the book that changed my life I talked about when we started here, Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich.
Do you think that book would have the impact on just about anybody reading it? I mean, is it that impactful, or was it because of maybe your time in life, or you had an appreciation?
I think my time in life, maybe like I was a senior in college and I was having this existential, but I've read it since, and great pieces of art speak to you in different ways throughout your life. Yeah. So, you know, you're a little older than me. Go read it. I mean, I'm telling you, it's a novella. You could read it in 90 minutes. Okay. I really, really do enjoy. You know, I've really liked this book that I've given again and again, and it's called Hannibal and Me, about learning kind of the best lessons of history, and in your own personal life. So Hannibal and Me is another one that I really, really enjoy. And, you know, maybe for a third one, my favorite American novel of all time is A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. So, yeah.
All right. Real nice. Jeremy Adams, thanks a lot for coming in. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. The book is hollowed out. Everybody should be picking it up. Now, if somebody has, after the podcast, some extra questions for you, or not the trolls out there, all the good people.
I've had enough mean people.
If all the good people,
only nice people
want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to just reach out and shoot you a question or something?
You can find me on the Bakersfield High website, or you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @JeremyAdams6, JeremyAdams6.
Fantastic. Jeremy Adams, thank you for being here.
It was an honor. Thank you.
Jeremy, pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
This show has been brought to you by the Law Office of Kyle Jones, Troy Burden with the Lynn Company, CPA John Duffield, Scott Hansen, real estate lender, broker, and investor, and Eckroth, LLC, a sales and marketing agency. You've been listening to the Our 2 Cents podcast. Check out the show notes for links and more information about the show. Also visit our website at our2centspodcast.com or check us on Instagram at Our 2 Cents Podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe.